Hope sent a quiver. Written by OrionLady on AO3. Read by Alexstress. Chapter 13. The moment Laura Barton opened her eyes and saw Clint's back beside her, she remembered the date. Her stomach flip-flopped in a painful twist. Monday. It's Monday. The first Monday in May, to be precise. Clint was actually still asleep, a shock with morning light sheening off the tireless mobile over their heads. Laura levered up on her elbow and allowed herself a moment to savour Clint's lax face, though bags under his eyes screamed the truth of how long he'd lain awake before falling asleep last night. No surprise there. "Honey," Laura rubbed her husband's bare arm. "I'm going to feed Pete, okay?" Clint stirred. He swayed upright once the words registered, hair positively everywhere. "Pete, gotta take him breakfast." "Shh, I know. Go back to sleep." Clint, in nothing but his boxers and still half asleep, tried to lift the covers. Laura caught his hand. "Babe, I'm bringing the car around. It's okay." The words flipped a toggle in Clint's brain, pure instinct. He stopped moving, dried tear tracks visible now on grainy skin. Also no surprise. Laura's eyes burned in response anyway, her lips trailing up his bicep to his neck. "Please," she whispered against his cheek. "Sleep. Leave the kids to me, at least for this morning. You're in no shape." "I can be," Clint slurred. "But you don't have to be. Let's take shifts falling apart at the seams, shall we? I'm claiming the afternoon to have a good cry." Clint let her delicate hand press him back down, eyes somewhere off in the distance and off on a planet Laura had never seen and never would. Even when Clint explained the whole thing last year in excruciating and unbearable detail, she still didn't quite understand what happened that day. Dressing in her favourite orange blouse and jeans, Laura stood in front of the mirror to psych herself to go downstairs. Today never hit her or the kids as hard as Clint. It only hurt because of Clint's pain, the agony he refused to share completely. Laura couldn't fault him for that. The fraction he'd told her alone gave her horrific nightmares. Lila and Cooper already sat at the kitchen table when Laura breezed downstairs. Nate on the living room carpet, playing with his plastic dinosaurs. His gravelly "Rawr" filled the room. "Anybody up for cereal before school?" asked Laura. "Or are we feeling fried eggs on bagel?" Silence. Laura turned from rifling through the bread box. "Guys?" Lila and Cooper held a conversation using just their eyes. Uncanny, really, since Laura and Clint did the exact same thing with the exact same brow flip whenever they needed to ask each other a question without speaking. "Is Dad okay?" Lila finally braved in a small voice. "Today's the anniversary," said Cooper, like Laura didn't already have that playing in her head in a sick leitmotif. Laura sat across from them and took one each of their hands. "Dad's having a rough start, but he'll be here and ready when you get home from school. You don't have to attend today if you don't want, by the way. I know a lot of other kids take the day off." In celebration, thought Laura, working hard not to feel bitterness for their joy. They deserve to enjoy it. Lila glanced between them. "It doesn't bother me like it does Dad. I think I'd rather be with my friends." "Dad needs the space," said Cooper, ever wise. Laura nodded. "I hate to say it, but some quiet in the house wouldn't hurt." At once, they all turned to Nate, now making explosion sounds as his T-Rex figurines crashed claw first into each other. He giggled after he did it. Thus followed a truly ghastly and cartoonish narration about the dinosaurs fighting over who got to destroy the asteroid before the nematodes could devour Earth. Laura nodded, spine straight. "Right, cereal it is." Easier was better today, and she could use the sugar to perk herself up. Enticed by the lucky charms, Nate scurried up from his action film in progress. The other three took a breath at the cessation of his playtime sounds, and Laura thanked heaven above for having such easy-going children. After they'd eaten, she bundled all three kids into the car and drove them 5 minutes to the bus stop, since their farmhouse was set so remote and far away from the main road. Nate sang along to the radio, oblivious to the atmosphere of the day, and that helped Lila too, a smile fixed on her face by the time they rolled up to the crowd of country residents' kids. "Have a good day," Laura called, waving Lila out the door. Cooper didn't unbuckle or move. He'd clenched a hand on the knee of his jeans. "Coop, honey?" Laura reached across to the stick to brush her knuckles over his cheek. "You'll keep an eye on Dad today?" Cooper sounded younger than a newly minted 17-year-old. "I don't like it when he fakes being happy." Images of Clint's time incarcerated flitted between them, as the only two who really remembered that time. Lila and Nate had been too young. "I promise, Cooper. I'm not leaving him alone for a minute. This will not be a repeat of last year. Clint promised he wouldn't lock himself away or pretend, and he keeps his promises." "Okay." Cooper took a deep breath. "Okay, I can do this then." He joined his sister with a goodbye high five for Nate in his booster seat. Laura left her roadside blinker on and made a quick call. Once she hung up, she turned to Nate. "Hey, baby. How do you feel about a playdate with Mason today?" Nate kicked his little sneakers. Yeah, we can play Power Rangers." "Done deal." Laura grinned. "Mason's mum said he's been missing you anyway." They were overdue for their monthly playdate, and Mrs. Cattrall saw today as a holiday, a festive occasion. She relished the extra children in the house when Laura dropped off Nate on her doorstep. Her eyes were knowing, however, when the kids ran downstairs to play. "You take care of yourself amongst all this worrying about Clint, you hear?" Laura's smile was weak but genuine. "I'm doing my best." "I'll keep Nathaniel as long as you need, Laura. Don't even give it a second thought." "One of us will be back to pick him up this afternoon." Laura returned to the house by 9, relieved to still be on schedule, and that they still had slices of lasagna left over from the previous evening. It saved her having to prepare or fuss over food, and she packed 3 slices plus some muffins topped off by a few gummy worm brownies. "I'm coming, Pete." Laura loaded everything in a bag and slipped on her thick hiking boots, just in case the deer path was muddy today. It took a few wrong turns through the trees before she spotted a familiar black rectangle in the distance. "Pete!" Laura heard the hammock rustle behind the curtain. "Pete, sweetie, it's Laura." A rattled breath. She pushed aside the garbage bag to see Pete on the other side of the hammock, so it hung between them as a barricade, and stopped at the distress in the boy's eyes. He clutched his backpack to his chest. "Hey." Laura kept her voice soft, oozing sympathy, like when Nate was sick and wanted cuddles. "Sorry if I scared you, honey. I just came to bring you breakfast. I can leave it in the hammock and walk away if you want." Pete eyed surrounding trees. He rocked from one foot to the other to crane his gaze behind her. His hand ringed his eye in a sign she recognized from the last week. Clint had gleefully twirled her around and demonstrated the sign Pete had given him, and waved his index finger. "Where's Clint?" Laura's lips pinched between her teeth. She tried not to let the question hurt, unsurprised. Clint had been the boy's primary provider for the last 6 weeks. Change was hard on any kid, especially one as alone in the world as Pete, and he had to be off balance from the sudden shift in routine. Laura's hand tightened around the Tupperware. "Clint isn't... he didn't feel up for leaving his room today, so it's just me." Laura was surprised by the pang of longing that rang through clear to her molars at Pete's crestfallen look. Not envy exactly, for she was thrilled Pete trusted her husband more lately, but an arcane need in the recesses of her heart for him to lean on her like that. "He's sick?" No, it's just that today is the 2-year anniversary. Pete continued with the blank face. Restoration Day, the world's governments are calling it. Pete mouthed an O as once he realised. Laura snorted. I'm glad the populace convinced our government not to make it a national holiday, like the president wanted. Kind of insensitive, I think. I respect that a lot of people see it as a celebration, my kids included, since it's the day we all came back. But some people died too, you know. A neighbour down the road lost her husband because he rematerialised on a busy road and was struck. Me and the kids were lucky we all appeared right on the porch and... Sorry, Pete. I shouldn't be unloading all this on you. But Pete's face took on a keen edge, present in a way she hadn't been privy to so far. Intelligence and compassion shone in loamy brown eyes. Clint hurt? He's not physically injured. Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. I had a hard time getting him to eat last year, and today is shaping up to be more of the same. At least he's not pretending to be happy. That was awful. Pete straightened and looped his arms through the backpack. I see him? Laura's mouth worked. She took a step closer, and Pete took a half step back. Her heart galloped in the hot part of her throat. You want to visit Clint? Pete nodded. He won't leave our room, you understand. That would mean going inside the house. Pete lost a little colour, but he also got that shy wrinkle on the side of his nose that Laura ached to smooth away, that made her want to hug him until he was 40, and nodded again. Okay, said Laura in a big exhale. She cleared her throat and it didn't work. Okay, well, okay. I can work with this. Alrighty then, let's go. Loath to turn around, lest Pete make a break for it in the other direction, Laura slowly pivoted on her heel. She stepped around the curtain and found the now worn-down path back to the house. One day at a time, Laura. One person at a time. And today that happens to be Clint and a semi-mute teenage boy. A peek over her shoulder revealed Pete, following a few feet behind like a baby duckling. Alert eyes mapped her hair, nose, freckles and blouse, of all things, then flicked away when he noticed her watching. It dawned in jilted bursts. Laura backed up a bit so she walked beside Pete, to which the teen stiffened but didn't pull away. Pete, do I remind you of someone? Pete wouldn't meet her eyes. Yes. I look a lot like her. A complex tapestry of grief thatched across his face. Orange was her favourite colour. I'm sorry. Pete didn't say anything more, but he also stayed step for step at Laura's side, so she took it as a win. This was the closest she'd gotten to this strange, tender-hearted boy. She could stretch out her hand to brush his matted curls if she wanted, though she didn't dare. The mother in her moaned to see him so ill-kempt, to know that someone's baby had been beaten and left to starve on his own. When they hit the field, Pete halted. Just like that. Marching to frozen solid in less time than it took Laura to turn around. She stopped too, and waited for the vicious internal struggle to play out. Pete's hands clamped and unclamped into fists, red around the roots of his hair. Courage, or perhaps undiluted stubbornness, warred with fear. You don't have to come a step farther if you don't want to, Pete. I'm not making you do anything you don't want to. Pete locked eyes with Laura for the briefest of seconds. By the time he shrank away from the eye contact, Laura had relaxed. There was only one possible outcome to this, no matter how long it took to happen. Pete lifted his foot in Cooper's old sneaker. It hovered an ephemeral beat of catharsis and terror, and it landed in the grass. The closest Pete had ever come to the Barton house. Laura siphoned in a shaky breath. So did Pete. The other foot joined the first, then stepped out again, and again, and again, until Pete was closer to the tire swing than the trees. Sweat poured down his temples, fighting tooth and nail against a memory Laura couldn't see, fighting for his life. Sometimes a look of almost guilt or self-doubt flashed in his vulnerable eyes, but never stayed long enough for her to read. They continued at that snail's pace for another 5 minutes, all the way up to the fence, another 2 minutes to the porch. "You're doing so great, honey. This is amazing." Pete breathed shallow in his chest, but nodded. He signed Clint's name again. "Not doing this for you, huh?" Pete shook his head. Laura didn't care why he was psyching himself up to come into the house. She didn't care if it was to help Clint. Pete was inside a house for the first time in who knew how long. Under a roof. Well, almost inside. Pete lingered in the open doorway once he made it up the porch steps, far longer than he had at the tree line. "Mrs. Barton?" Laura's heart leapt to hear him speak her name, even in that fearful cracked tone. "It's Laura, sweetie." He cut a fast look at her. "Mrs. Laura?" "I owe Clint $20 for assuming he made this up. Pete really is that polite." Is there..." Laura followed his eyeline into the house, a few of Nate's toy trucks mixed with their shoes in the mud mat. She stepped inside and cleared a path through the chaos. "No one else is home, Pete. Cooper and Lila are at school, and Nate's with a friend, just like the day I came to visit you with the cupcakes." Pete's shoulders lowered away from his ears, jingling the pack on his back. He put a toe into the foyer, pulled it back. This repeated a few more times while Pete turned a steady shade of green. Laura smiled warmly. "Take your time." She left Pete to sort himself out, setting the bag of food on the kitchen counter on her way by. She hummed while rinsing cereal bowls in the sink and plopping them in the finicky dishwasher. Hopefully it would decide to work properly today. She didn't relish a repeat of the kitchen puddle last week. The sound of rubber soles discarded on the mat, some sniffles and murmured self-talk. Sock feet padded their way into the kitchen a few minutes later. Laura's heart still pounded, but she kept her face loose when Pete shifted into her peripheral vision. He stared at everything like a kid in a museum, from Nate's booster seat to the toy dinosaurs to the basket of Lila's hair ties on the coffee table, even the laundry to be folded on the couch. "Welcome to our home, Pete," said Laura, gentle. Pete shook himself from a daydream, and his hands started up. "Do you have..." Laura mourned the loss of his voice, but it was to be expected. She squinted. "I'm sorry, I don't know that last sign." "Froyo." "Frozen yogurt?" Today's daily curveball, brought to you by Pete. Laura dried her hands. "I have some in the freezer. Why?" Pete squared his shoulders. "I can get him to eat." A tall order. Clint wasn't a self-harmer by any definition of the term, even with food, but he tended to get so lost in his head, the sorrow, that sometimes his appetite was non-existent. Years of going hungry on missions and training his body to survive on meager nutrition didn't help matters any. That, or he'd have a nightmare and vomit up everything in his stomach. Laura had yet to decide which option was worse. But nothing beat the agonizing pretending of last year. Nothing. She'd take 2 days of Clint going hungry to that forced cheer. "I'm not sure how it will help, but knock yourself out." Laura retrieved an untouched tub of lemon chocolate ginger swirl from the freezer. "I find myself craving bizarre flavors lately. Weird, huh?" The first positive expression Laura had ever seen from the boy lightened his face, the ghost of a smile. He whispered his reply. "Yeah, weird." Armed with the tub and 2 spoons, Pete took the lead going upstairs. "Our room is the first door on the left," Laura explained, trailing after him. Part of her was still afraid to blink at his presence in their house, as if he'd vanished, the sun's suffused light on his curls through their bay window and his socks stepping over Nate's toys on the chairs. It felt right. Laura could no sooner imagine him leaving after this puzzle piece slotting into place than lariat the moon. Laura almost stopped Pete when he reached their bedroom door, on the very plausible chance that Clint wasn't ready to be seen like this. But she didn't have the heart when Pete being here was such a novelty. And besides, it's not like she had any better ideas. She'd run out of inspiration to comfort Clint days ago. Pete and Laura hedged around the doorframe at the same time, only to see Clint on the floor at the foot of the bed, shoebox in his lap. He wore his plaid pajama pants now, and a dark fluffy sweater. Laura bit back a sob. She remembered him opening that sweater one Christmas from Nat. He hadn't taken it off for 3 days straight. It represented happier, simpler times. Pete shuffled for a moment, trembling in faint waves, then mustered his nerve. He took one modest step into the room. Clint. Both adults stilled. Clint's head shot up, and Laura couldn't hold back a gasp. It seemed to her that for one treasured pulse of time, one parsec that followed zero logic when she tried to explain it later, the moon and the stars and the sun all shone in the same time in the visible wavelengths or speckles on the floor, silvery and golden light embracing the space across Clint's legs where he sat within beam range of the window. That all the veiled things in the world, especially that fuzzy place in her brain when she looked at Pete, suddenly made complete and perfect sense and followed a pattern that she'd glimpsed in a pass of supernatural understanding. Hope blossomed in the dome of her heart. Petals unfurling against her chest. She knew with 100% certainty that all 3 of them were supposed to be here, without question, in this very room, together with its ticking mobile and Clint's tear-stained face, and that, in fact, everything so far in recent years had led them here, to this exact moment with malnourished Pete saying Clint's name for the first time and extending the tub of frozen yogurt like it held the key to the universe. And for that weightless beat of time, Pete did hold the keys. The universe's gravity bowed under the weight of his love, stretched out to Clint in the form of 2 spoons and earnest eyes. Laura's hand flew to her mouth to stifle any more noises, and the moment faded. Pete, oblivious to the detonation of their shock, slid another foot into the room. But Clint stared at the boy, unblinking. His eyes darted past Pete to Laura. She nodded. He's really here, Moonpie. I see him too. Clint wiped his eyes. Pete, I'm so proud of you, buddy. You're being so brave. Pete didn't say sorry for his loss, like Laura would have. He just placed the tub in Clint's lap beside the shoebox and slid off his backpack. Can I? Of course you can. Clint gazed at Pete with nothing short of adoration. He shuffled sideways to make room on the floor. You're always welcome here. Always. I'm just not very good company today. Pete arranged himself cross-legged next to Clint, their sides pressed together, and tapped their spoons in a toast. Clint managed an actual smile when he saw the tub label. Blow Laura over with a feather. This flavor is disgusting. She would love it. Pete nodded. Together they wrangled off the tub lid and dig in with big scoops. The respectful option here would be to leave, give the 2 some privacy in their odd morning ritual. But Laura caved to the selfish desire and sat against the closet doors across and down the wall from them, her right leg stretched out so it was a few inches from Pete's. Clint ate a few bites, and so did Pete, both making faces at the taste. But they kept going, alike in their perseverance. Pete flipped his spoon around when it was in his mouth, just like Clint always did. The mirrored action brought tears to Laura's eyes. My boys. A risky thought to have, but just for today, Laura allowed herself the luxury, didn't let herself overthink it. Clint set down his spoon to show Pete the most recent photo he had of Natasha, Tony and Bruce that day they'd lain on the table during their time heist planning, and Clint snuck a picture with his phone. Pete's eyes welled up when he touched the picture. Clint hooked a gentle arm around his neck and tucked him into his side. "I'm sorry, Pete. You lost a best friend too. We both know what that feels like." Pete's own grief oozed in the eyes he locked on the picture. He and Clint cried in silence for a while, Clint flipping through the hefty stack of pictures in the shoebox with his free hand. At the bottom of it lay Nat's old widow bites and her favourite pocket-sized copy of The Little Prince that she'd left in the compound before they left to steal back the Infinity Stones. Clint paused for a while on a picture of Nat in her rash guard at the beach, mid-laugh at Cooper guarding his sandcastle from being destroyed by a big wave. She wasn't as hard as everyone thought. Cared more. Loved to be silly with the kids. Was a huge dork in her own right. You two would have gotten along great. Pete nodded against Clint's shoulder where his head had landed. Now, no one will ever know that but me and a handful of people, many of whom are gone. Clint's breath hitched. My best friend died 2 years ago today. She said in her will that she didn't want a grave or a memorial, but it's hard when the time capsule of those memories in people is dwindling. Not that we even had a body to... Clint was forced to stop, and to Laura's surprise, Pete shook hard too, tears a river down his face. It occurred to Laura, perhaps far later than it should have, that Clint needed this more than reassurance or space or attempts to cheer him up. Just someone to sit in total, wordless quiet and cry too. Laura had done plenty of weeping for Nat and Tony, but not with Clint. Then again, Pete apparently perceived more of what went on in Clint's heart in this one regard than her. "I miss them," the boy blurted. Clint kissed his hair and whispered, "I miss my friends too. I respect their choices and how they sacrifice themselves, but I wish they never had to." Something about the inclusion of Tony in that grief, or confessing it out loud, or maybe even just Pete's twiggy body against him, started Clint off in quiet sobs that he hadn't voiced yet today. He covered his mouth and tipped his head back on the mattress. Distress worked up on Pete's face again. He rooted for his backpack beside him and fumbled with one of the zippers. He unclipped something, flipped it on. A tiny arc reactor keychain, and pressed it into Clint's hand for once. It dropped from his eyes. "It always helps me," said Pete, closing Clint's wet fingers around it. Clint just cried harder, body racking and heaving from the force of each gust. He hadn't even mourned like this during Stark's memorial at the lake house, to which Pete looked worried until Clint cupped the back of his head. He wrapped Pete up in his arms so tightly his biceps flexed under the sweater, and Pete started hiccuping too, the blue light turning their tears to comet tails. "Precious boy," Clint breathed between sobs. "You're such a good kid, Pete." Pete closed his eyes with a spasm of heart pain across his face, but he allowed himself to burrow into the hold with only one more guilty look. A luxury, just like Laura's thought. She quietly stood on shaky legs and gave them some privacy by heading downstairs, losing herself in the folding of laundry and wiping sticky juice spills. Nat had sat at this very table and taught Toddle and Nathaniel the few signs she knew, had learned along with Laura and Clint for what they thought would be an indefinite muteness on the boy's part. She hadn't even questioned it, or treated Nate any different than her other children. She'd helped teach Cooper and Lila to read, and kept every single picture Lila painted her. They were still up in another shoebox among Nat's belongings in the spare room. Laura stopped and hung her head, hands braced on the counter. "Raising them is harder without you, Tash. They need their Auntie Nat, and so do I." Tony too lived in this house, the liminal space between its memories. After the fight with Steve, he didn't visit, but before that he used to show up unannounced, just to drink her terrible burnt coffee and listen to her ramble about range-free chickens or fix something around the house. He never stayed long enough to eat dinner, just an hour or two. Yet he always made time to help with something. Sometimes she caught his wistful look at it all, like Clint was actually the richest man alive. Her eyes fell on the leaky dishwasher. Tony would have fixed it months ago. "You should be here too, Stark," she whispered. Had it really been almost a decade since they first met, all 6 Avengers in her house and looking ready to collapse? Lila had painted Steve's nails while he tried hard to hide the tremble in his hands. Laura blinked away the after-image, and her living room was just a living room again. No superheroes or dorky aunts to be found. When she peered in their bedroom an hour or so later, Clint had fallen asleep with Pete sideways on his lap, head resting on Pete's crown, frozen yogurt left to melt by the closet. Pete looked up, eyes red-rimmed but calmer. Laura sagged on the doorframe like an ice cream cone in a sauna. "He tell you more stories about Natasha?" Pete nodded a fist. He turned red for a different reason and signed "help," one-handed, thumbs up. Laura stifled a laugh. "Need to use the bathroom, but he's got you trapped, huh?" Pete went bashful, all curls in front of his eyes and fingers bunched in Clint's sweater front. It was an action a child would do, reminiscent of Cooper as a toddler. Laura knelt in front of them and carefully extracted Clint's weighty arm from around Pete's back, then the one protecting his head. Clint tightened around it in his sleep. They held their breaths. Then he let go. Laura was reminded that her husband could snap a man's neck in one hand if he had to, yet it warmed something in her to see that strength used to comfort. Pete looked almost drunk at the contact, swaying up to his feet thanks to Laura's hand under his thin elbow. Touch-starved. Not exactly a revelation either. Not with months under Pete's belt without so much as a hug before he got here. We'll have to work on that too. As such, inundated, Pete hardly noticed Laura's hand on his arm, their first physical contact. He carried his backpack in the other hand, with a white-knuckled grip like Laura might try to filch it from him. "You want me to rescue your nightlight?" Pete looked at the chain snuggled in Clint's hand, a steady aquamarine point in the room. He shook his head. "He can keep it for now. Makes bad days better." Laura did what she'd wanted to for 6 weeks, and brushed a hair out of Pete's eyes. It was baby soft to the touch, even greasy and knotted. "Our ensuite bathroom is right there." Laura guided him to the door by their bed. Pete blinked. "You're welcome to have a shower as well if you want. Use any of our shampoo or body wash, please. Tony built our hot water heater from scratch, so it pretty much never runs out." Pete's eyes filled with a shallow line, too exhausted for more emotion than that. He pointed at the mobile. Laura clutched his arm a little tighter. "Yeah, Tony built that too. How did you know that?" "Guess," Pete rasped, pale. "Oh." Laura released him. "Good guess. You okay to stand on your own in the shower for an extended period? Should I get a chair?" Pete shook his head. Laura rubbed his arm. "I'll be right downstairs when you finish, or if you need help. And I'll leave some clothes out for you to change into. You can have lasagna for lunch." Thanks, Mrs. Laura." Laura stood there until she heard the door lock and the shower start up. A spell hung over the womb of their space for a few minutes, the sound of water on the tub floor, Clint's even breaths, the nightlight casting a corona over his eyelashes, the mobile ticking in counterpoint to Pete's hums to himself. Not singing hums like Lila in the shower during her one-woman performances, but thinking hums, like Nate did before he could talk using words. A bottle clanked, and Pete rummaged around them for a bit, with 1-2 hums. Series sort of sounds. No more crying or sniffling, just the lather of suds hitting the tile, so Laura felt stable enough to head downstairs after she dug out some clothes and folded them by the door. She replaced the frozen yogurt tub in the freezer with a faint grin. She'd almost finished a page of Sudoku puzzles at the island when the stairs griped in sequence. Sock feet hit the first floor's hardwood. Laura glanced at the doorway and dropped her pencil. Oh, Pete. Pete stood there in fresh clothes, one of Clint's soft forest green hoodies and khaki pants. They were some of the most recently laundered, not a spot on them, but that wasn't what snagged Laura's breath in her throat. Pete's freshly washed hair puffed up higher than they'd ever seen it, curls positively cherubic. Without the dirt, they were a lighter colour too, much lighter than Laura expected, more of a toffee bronze than the auburn it had been. Wow! Laura beheld him in a wonder she couldn't have dimmed if he'd asked. Pete, you look like you. And he did. She didn't have words to explain it, but he looked like Pete now. You feel better? Pete, all blush, nodded. He kept his hands stiffly at his sides. Thank you for the shower. Laura smiled. Of course, Pete. You never have to thank us for what you need. You want to eat? I can heat up some food. Pete didn't answer, but he hopped up onto a stool at the counter, so she didn't look a gift horse in the mouth, although she noted that he waited for her to move out of the way first. Laura stuck a piece of lasagna and a blueberry muffin in the microwave, then slid him a brownie on a napkin. I believe in dessert before a meal. Call me crazy, but that's how I was raised. Pete took a bite out of sheer politeness and gave her a thumbs up. The sight of gummy worm disappearing into his cheek made her smile. And Pete? Laura leaned on her elbows to be his eye level. Thank you for getting Clint to eat, even if it was just an atrocious flavour of froyo. He hasn't been able to sleep much today, or receive affection very well, so you sort of knocked all three out of the park. Pete's cheeks burned and he looked away. It means a lot. Laura finished, patting his hand. You guys work well together. A real smile lit up Pete's face in that touched, shy sort of way. Laura turned to hide her own, the privilege of seeing him happy and connected to someone a balm on her maternal side. Pete nibbled on the lasagna when she presented it in front of him and heated up her own piece. Every few seconds, he pushed aside a curl so it didn't get in his mouth along with the food. Laura's heart clenched. Should I? Pete, hey. Laura headed to Lila's hair basket on the coffee table and dug out a wide-toothed comb. Would you let me brush out some of those knots? I guess. Laura's husband was asleep peacefully upstairs, and she burned with courage. Screw it. Better yet, would you... I get that it's scary, but could I cut your hair for you? Pete froze. He set down his fork and glowered at the lasagna. It's perfectly acceptable to say no. I won't be mad. Scissors in the hands of someone you don't know very well takes a lot of trust. Pete touched his head, exploring the web of interconnected rings and strands. His eyes grew troubled, astonished even. Clumped, he said. Laura nodded with the realization that he must not have looked at himself in the upstairs mirror. It is, yeah. How long since you've truly brushed it? Pete sighed, looking ancient. Laura's joints ached at the expression and Pete's haunted frown. 5 months. Laura's ears rang for a moment. Is that how long you've been without a place to stay, Pete? Since December? Yeah. Well, that was... okay. Laura turned away again, this time to privately freak out under the guise of rummaging for clean paper scissors from the drawer by the fridge. She had to set down the scissors when her hand shook, sheer emotional diffuse from the reality that this boy hadn't had adult help in months. You can cut it. Laura swiveled back around. Really? I'll go nice and slow and tell you everything I'm doing. Pete nodded a hand, back to nonverbal. Laura's beaming expression wasn't hindered. I cut all the kids here, and sometimes Clint's. The spots in the back he can't reach, so I've had lots of practice." She draped a towel around Pete's shoulders to ensure the loose hair didn't go on down his shirt. "I'm going to start at the front, your bangs, so you can see me. Tap my arm whenever you feel unsafe, and I'll stop at once. Sound good?" A fisted nod. "Awesome." Laura combed the filigree curls, delighted by how they sprang away from the comb teeth. Between hers and Clint's straight-locked jeans, none of their kids had any type of curl in their hair, except for Nate with his bushy locks. But even they were thick and rippled rather than angled. Just brushing it out for now. Once Pete cottoned on to the fact that he didn't have to hold himself like the statue of David, he relaxed and kept eating. Laura turned off her spinning thoughts, a mental do not disturb button, and settled into the familiar rhythm of tidying up a child's hair. Pete took a lot more finagling than she was used to, ringlets wanting to cling together. Laura treated him in this process like she would a small child. No tugs or pulls. The curls practically swallowed her fingers when she dug down for his roots and baby cowlicks at the base of his head. She had to hold back a besotted smile. To her sorrow, some parts wouldn't budge, too matted with dead bugs and mud to salvage. Laura blocked off sections she'd have to cut. This beautiful boy deserves better. Understatement of the year. 5 months he'd been on his own. Clint would lose his mind when he found out. And that's just how long Pete had been homeless, not how long he'd been mistreated or hungry. Finally, Laura set down the comb and picked up the scissors. Pete, likewise, set down his fork and went rigid again. "You ready, Tiger?" Pete eyed the blade. "Safe?" "Yeah, bub." Laura let Pete hold and examine the scissors' edge. "They're safe. I'm not going to hurt you or myself with them." "Okay." Laura clipped his bangs first, and Pete jumped as the curls landed in his lap. He sat up straighter, though, as if shedding a weight. "There we go." Laura nudged his shoulder. "That feels better, doesn't it?" Snip, snip, snip. The scissors were the only sound for a long time, weeding out chained together sections of Pete's head. He hummed. The hum devolved into a warble. "Pete?" Pete hid his face in his hands. Laura stepped away immediately and perched beside him on the other bar stool, heart one giant throb in her chest. "Pete, baby." Tears leaked between his fingers. "If this is too much, we can stop." No." "Are you sure? Because this has been one giant trust fall today. It's okay to pace yourself and know your limits." I'm sure. You can keep going." "Okay. Thank you for this, Pete." Laura stood and continued clipping, small snips just in case he changed his mind. "I'm almost done anyway. I just have a few spots at the back." True to her word, she freed his head of knots. They even made a thumping sound against the linoleum, and evened them up in another 10 minutes. She gave the whole thing a second combing and clipping a few last stray hairs. Liberated from the weight, and with each strand no longer than his earlobe, the curls fluffed in a halo. Cutest dang thing Laura had ever seen. "Want to take a good look at yourself, Pete?" She held up her phone as a mirror, front-facing camera on. Pete's tears were silent, but the eyes that appeared when he lowered his hands wailed. His jaw about hit the floor. It's like he'd never seen himself before, and, to be honest, had Laura not known it was him and laundered the clothes he currently wore, she's not sure she would have recognized him either. Pete touched his clean face, the freckles and milky skin where the bruises were mere outlines now. He looked over at Laura. "Thank you." Laura placed a hand on his knee and thumbed it. "Did a woman do this for you last time too? The same woman I remind you of?" Pete nodded, chin quivering. A wad of papier-mâché thickened in Laura's throat. "Come here." Laura threw sensitive progression and child therapy textbooks to the wind. She looped him into the circle of her arms. Carefully, not too tight, but without a hint of hesitation about it. "That's it, Pete. We're all right." Pete keened, muffled in her shirt, right into that orange blouse a woman in Pete's life would have loved, someone who had cared for him once. His arms remained tucked against his own body, but his forehead sagged against her. "I'm so sorry she's gone, Pete. All of them." Laura kissed his temple. "So sorry." They huddled like that, a ball of worried mum and a heartbroken child, for another 20 minutes, every second a cherished memory. He fit perfectly in Laura's arms, like he had Clint's, compact and lanky and alive under her hands. Forget the haircut. This was likely the first time he'd hugged a woman in ages. Laura embraced Pete like she'd never get to again, feeling the grief and its energy drain out of him in agitated trickles. This might very well be the only time she'd get to hold him. The thought nearly buckled her knees. There came a point when his weight almost matched hers, heavy so that she had to balance back on her heels. "Pete?" She grinned at the sleepy response. "Think you can lie down for a bit?" Cried out, Pete was pretty much asleep on his feet when Laura tugged him to standing and in motion. He clung to the hem of her shirt. They made it through the kitchen doorway, across from the stairs, her arm never leaving his shoulders. "Right up there. Here we have a guest room. You can... Pete?" Pete veered to the left instead of the right, for the front door. It left a cool spot against her side where his body heat faded. Laura must have cried out, for he slowed. "No," she said before she could run that frantic word through a more sensible part of her brain. "Please, you don't have to go back to sleeping in the woods, not ever again." "You can't possibly want that. Please tell me you don't." Pete stood there in the sea of shoes and umbrella and toys for a long time, far longer than Laura thought he would. He looked at everything, every single angle of her foyer and hallway, much like Tony always did, oddly enough, memorizing it, weighing his cluttered lived-in environment to his hammock. Pete opened the front door, retrieving his backpack along the way, and Laura almost collapsed onto her knees. This 2 steps forward and 1 step back process had never hurt so much. She couldn't do it. Laura couldn't watch this boy sleep in the woods one more night. Not after today. Not after the hug. Then she poked her head out and saw him stretched on the porch swing, head pillowed on a rolled-up Elsa blanket and his backpack, eyes already closed. "Okay," said Laura. She laughed through her tears. "That's great, baby. You stay right there for as long as you want." When she spread a fleece comforter over him and tucked it around his shoulders, he smiled in his sleep.